Given the science fiction nature of the Halo series, it only stands to reason that the series has had its fair share of exotic and alien creatures, some completely docile, but most extremely hostile. In today's episode of The Evolution of Halo, we're going to be taking a look at perhaps Halo's most exotic alien race, the Hunters. If you enjoy the video or learn something interesting, consider giving it a like and sharing it around. A special thank you to the folks I talked to who provided much of the information in the video, as well as Halo leaks for the footage used during the Halo Infinite portion of the video, and my own fiancée, Rebecca, who helped get some Infinite footage. With all that being said, let's get started. The development of the first Halo is familiar to any seasoned Halo fan. It began its life as a science fiction RTS before shifting to an action-packed third-person open-world game. Before the shift to consoles also came with a shift in perspective, mainly that of the first-person variety. The game would see the heroic forces of humanity marooned and stranded on an alien-made ring world, Halo. With not many options, the survivors of the crash engage in an intense war with the extraterrestrial Covenant Empire as they uncovered the secrets buried beneath Halo. The forces that make up the Covenant army were unique and each came with their own AI routines, personalities, and predictable behavior loops that helped make them feel remarkably lifelike for the time. The combat loop was broken up into the cowardly grunts who acted as the cannon fodder, the defensive jackals with their shields, and the aggressive commanders, the elites. But one of the biggest show stealers during the campaign was the Covenant's heavy units, the Hunters. During development, the Hunters were born from a desire to have a heavy trooper to act as an alternative to the speedy agility of the elites. As artist Shikai Wang recalls, he began using the Hygog mobile suits from the popular Gundam series as inspiration. Some aspects of Halo's scrap sniper unit were also folded into the design, before eventually taking quite a bit of a liking to fiddler crabs, and the concept of a heavy trooper with an oversized arm eventually won out. At the time, Bungie didn't care too much for lore or backstory, so not much was considered about who exactly these heavy troopers were, but Sheik recalls adding a little note in his sketchbook about them perhaps being composed of hundreds of alien worms, maybe something to revisit in the future. The heavy unit was given a long stomach so that, like the elites, there could be room for expressive body language to communicate their emotional state to players, hunched over when engaged in combat or stretched out and standing tall when at ease, showing the sheer size of these beings. Eventually, with a bit of playtesting, they were given a fuel rod gun, a shield on each arm, and eventually, a set of spines, and what we know as the Hunter was finally born. The Hunters of Halo Combat Evolved were formidable foes at a range, using their shields to protect their torso and using the fuel rod gun to hurl explosive blasts at the player. They towered over most Covenant units with their flexible spines, large shield, and distinct coloration, causing them to stand out, especially at range. Hunters always came in a pair, pitting the player against two due to the fun that came from the Hunters working off each other to repel the player. It was easy to feel intimidated by these monsters, but in a bit of solid game design, Bungie provided an exploitable weakness which, if acted upon, could bring them down in a matter of seconds, keeping tension high while making sure the fight didn't drag on or become tedious. Hunters are at their strongest when at range, but in close quarters, they were a bit like bulls, opting to charge at the player with a slow, lumbering, but hard-hitting melee attack. If sidestepped, the Hunters would accidentally expose their vulnerable backs to the players, allowing for a quick takedown, especially so if the player wielded a pistol, which took just one shot to best the charging beast. This charge, sidestep, takedown dance became a staple of the Hunter's combat loop. Many players have fond memories of baiting them into a doomed charge, and over the years, the skill of players in taking down Hunters has only grown. Since the moment they beamed down from the Covenant ship during the third level, to their surprise ambush on the player in Silent Cartographer, the Hunters of Halo Combat Evolved were a smash hit, becoming a fan-favorite enemy. The wise choice to make them a heavy enemy type that was sprinkled organically alongside the rest of the Covenant, rather than a once-in-a-blue-moon boss battle, helped them fit naturally into the campaign and provide moments of excitement when the green cannon shots began raining down around the player. This is where the Hunters began, and now let's see where they went. Halo Combat Evolved was a smash hit, not just for Microsoft, but for pop culture. The little console shooter proved it had the chops to become a household name with its excellent split-screen campaign experience and addictive multiplayer. A sequel was pretty much expected of Bungie. The actual development of the game was a stressful affair and one of the worst instances of crunch in gaming history, and it speaks to the talent of the developers that the game did pull through in the end and became a critical and commercial success. One of the key pillars of the game was exploring the Halo universe more deeply after the first game made only minor allusions to a greater world beyond the events of the Ring. During production, Joe Staten, lead writer and cinematics director, envisioned a story that explored the Covenant Empire's religion, the various races that comprised it, and what drove them. One element of the story was about a Covenant mining rig defecting and preaching the message that the Covenant religion was a lie, sowing the seeds of doubt that led to the downfall of the Covenant Empire. The final game has the player blasting heretic grunts and heretic elites, but Joe Staten originally wanted the heretics to be all hunters. As you can imagine, this idea was soundly rejected by many at Bungie due to a level entirely made up of hunters, offering extremely little variety for the designers to craft interesting encounters around. For the final game, the hunters would maintain their role from Halo Combat Evolved, but with a nice bump to their production value, behavior routines, and presentation. The Hunters of Halo 2 sport higher quality materials with new and improved animations. Their fuel rod gun was given a much needed redesign and even outfitted with some rather simplistic but neat claws. From their first encounter in the streets of Old Mombasa, they appeared during the campaign of Halo 2 in mostly the same role as their Combat Evolved counterpart, serving as a heavy infantry unit to spice up the gameplay and offer the same bull charge rhythm to their fights, just this time without the one-shot capabilities of a pistol, and a rather small but welcome change. Jamie Griesmer recalled that since hunters in Halo 2 are often fought in close environments in pairs, attacks will often come from off-screen and be relatively unavoidable in the close-quarter situations. So the choice was made to switch their fuel rod guns for a simple, dodgeable energy beam, playing quite well in the environments of Halo 2. Near the end of the campaign, the Covenant would finally begin to break, and the elites were being slaughtered by the brutes. It was during this purge when the Hunters came to the aid of the elites, perhaps an echo of what Joe Staten originally wanted. Despite the smaller scale environments compared to the first game, Halo 2 was able to take what worked about the Hunters and translate that combat rhythm into the smaller play spaces, and making sure not to rock the boat too much. Their appearance in Halo Combat Evolved may be legendary, and dare I say iconic, but that isn't to discount those who still vividly remember when the gates of Voi fell, and Halo 2's Hunters made their introduction. They were a fine addition to Halo's menagerie, and the future seemed bright. By the time of the Xbox 360, the Halo series was a powerful brand, iterating on the success that came before. Better visuals, stronger social features, and more modes, ways to play, and creative tools than ever before. Halo 3 would be the final chapter of the Halo trilogy, closing the story Bungie started back in 2001 in one big explosive campaign. It wouldn't be until Halo 3's fourth level, The Storm, when the Hunters would make their surprise appearance. By this point in the campaign, the game made sure to introduce players to new enemy types, vehicles, and weapons. But one enemy hadn't shown up yet, that was, until the player turned a single corner near the end of the mission and a nostalgic early Xbox era sound filled the ears. It was at this time when the Halo 3 Hunters made their first appearance in-game. The Hunters of Halo 3 more or less take Halo 2's design and build upon it, giving a healthy layer of specularity to bring out the alien metal and slime of the worms that make up their bodies. The Hunters canon also got a fresh, updated design, courtesy of artist Isaac Hannaford, much to Shikai Wang's delight, who wasn't satisfied with the rushed nature of their designs. Speaking of that claw cannon, the beam ability returns from Halo 2, with increased production value, and thanks to the increased number of physics objects in most of Halo 3's environments, a hunter encounter always guarantees some level of physics-related shenanigans. Once a hunter is killed, the surviving hunter will become significantly more aggressive, losing its cool and charging the player more often, allowing for an easy kill. It's a bit tragic in a way. Around this time, the lore of the Hunters were better defined in expanded media, The bipedal hunter forms always spawned in pairs from their worm colony. These pairs were functionally two halves of a single being. The bond between two hunters was deeper than that of a friend or even a sibling. And when one hunter is lost in combat, the surviving hunter would be sent into a deep despair. They'd lose their head, forgo any sense of tactics or survival, and wildly lash out at those around them, which would often lead to a quick death for the surviving one. Halo 3 was the first time this vulnerable side of the hunters manifested in-game, providing subtle character building through AI behavior, while also doubling as a way to conclude encounters quicker due to hunters being more enjoyable to fight in pairs. The hunters of Halo 3 didn't rock the boat too much, making sure to stay in their lane as heavy infantry and leaving the role of set-piece boss-like encounters to the much larger scarab tanks, which are also made up of hunter worms, but those will get their own video one day. Unfortunately, some could argue that Halo 3's hunters were a bit of a letdown. It's true that Halo 3's campaign was full of spectacle, impressive set pieces, and oozed production value, but the environments were larger this time. No longer was the game held back by the console limitations. This was new, more powerful hardware, and in the larger environments, the combat rhythm of the Halo 2 hunters does leave a lot to be desired. The beam cannon simply didn't do the damage it needed to do at range. There's a fine line between an enemy being too easy and an enemy going down quickly but with lots of tension. And Halo 3's hunters went down quickly and there wasn't a lot of tension. Where the Halo 3 hunters really shined, however, was the spin-off title, made in Halo 3's engine, Halo 3 ODST. Due to the player filling the boots of an orbital drop shock trooper, the hunters of Halo 3 ODST appear massive in size, flipping the civilian cars of New Mombasa with ease as they tore a path to the player. The hunters of Halo 3 ODST come in two variants, the standard blue-colored hunters with their Halo 2 energy beams, and then the golden hunters, which brandish fuel rod guns just like they did in the first game. These golden hunters were never named outside of their internal files, which labeled them as flak hunters. At a time when hunters were beginning to lose a bit of their thunder, the flak hunters injected a bit of excitement back into the towering monsters, bringing them back up and giving fans something to eagerly talk about. Halo 3 and its sister game ODST were the end of an era, and the next game in Bungie's repertoire would be their goodbye. Halo Reach was Bungie's final entry in the Halo series, leaving fans with a goodbye letter of a game that paid homage to the series' successful run under their studio. It told a prequel story about the events that led to humanity's last hope, the Pillar of Autumn discovering Halo, and the game painted this prequel in a much darker, grimmer tone than that of the trilogy. Thanks to Bungie's new engine, Halo Reach offered higher poly counts, more detail, and larger environments than any previous title. Most of the Covenant races saw redesigns that stayed faithful to their spirit while imbuing them with the level of detail worthy of the late Xbox 360 era shooter. The hunters of Halo Reach are a noticeable jump in quality from Halo 3, with plenty of scuffs, scratches, rust, and wear covering their shields and boots, which also feature more details than before. The mechanical, mecha anime influences that powered the Hunters' original concept art shone bright as the Hunters of Halo Reach confidently brandished their new, high-quality Covenant armor. Eyes were given to their helmets, and Forerunner glyphs can be found on the armor, the emblem of the Covenant gods. More worms can be clearly seen making up the body with nice, moving material layers to give a sense that the Hunter's body itself is composed of living organisms. And all in all, it led to a design for the Hunters that became somewhat of a staple for the series going forward, solidifying them as a heavy infantry superorganism outfitted with mechanized, tank-like armor. Their animations were also touched up quite a bit, adding more weight, physicality, and even retooling the old bull charge to be more of an aggressive attack. Despite being a new animation, it's still very readable in that classic Bungie way, easy to predict, and the hit detection for it is quite well timed, which allows for easy dodges. It could have been easy to get lost in the size and weight of the new hunters and their new animations, having them hunch constantly and rarely stand to their true height, a problem that future developers would unfortunately struggle with quite a bit as their slouch became more and more permanent. But here, in 2010, Bungie was able to keep their original flexibility in mind and preserve the spirit of the hunters dating back to Combat Evolved. Speaking of which, During gameplay, the beam cannon introduced in Halo 2 was swapped out for their classic fuel rod guns, a clever mechanical way to tie Halo Reach to the events of the first game, and also bring back a bit more tension to long-range gunfights. They're also most notably used in more creative and memorable ways than Halo 3, often getting their own special moments in the campaign that left players talking. One of these moments was during the game's New Alexandria mission that saw civilians and Marines trapped in a nightclub by squads of hunters. During development, the ability to board hunters like a vehicle was considered. Animations even exist for this in the game's files. It never made it to the final game for reasons that can only be speculated. The most common theory is it was possibly too powerful of an ability to use against what was simply a heavy infantry unit, whereas for vehicles, it made a bit more sense. Bungie left fans with a decade of critically acclaimed games, many of which were considered some of the greatest games of all time. From the moment they beamed down from the Truth and Reconciliation to Noble Six's last stand on Reach, the Hunters had always been one of Bungie's finest enemies, adding much-needed spice to encounters and providing players with unforgettable moments. But now, a new era of Halo was beginning, the Reclaimer era. For years, new studio 343 Industries had begun exploring, concepting, and crafting a new vision for the Halo universe, one that set itself apart from Bungie. Many concepts were explored for the Covenant foes of their first major title. Much of the mecha anime influences were gone, and initially something a bit angular and almost knight-like was explored for the Hunters, before being dropped for the beetle and insect aesthetic that was settled on for this new era of the Covenant. Early on, one of 343's artists, Glenn Israel, wanted 343 to really emphasize the fact Hunters were a collection of worms and not just very tall monsters. The more organic, shell-like armor was given beetle-like textures to contrast against the wet, slimy worms that form the structure of the Hunter. Even their distinct spines were changed to be wider, rounder, and more evocative of a worm. All the art studies, concepting, and work came together to form a Hunter design that stuck the landing quite well. Welcome to the new Hunters of the Reclaimer saga. Halo 4's Hunters are a standout in creature design, retaining the silhouette the Hunters were known for, while also moving forward in a new direction that didn't feel out of sync with their spirit. The graphical fidelity for these models was a tad lower than Halo Reach's, and their spines are noticeably less expressive, but this new, more beetle-like Hunter design stuck the landing quite well. What didn't work out quite as well was the combat loop. Many changes were made to the Halo 4 Hunters, making them less mobile, more prone to hunkering down and just spamming the player with attacks. Halo 4's Hunters reused many animations from Reach, such as the new bull charge, albeit sped up in odd ways that make dodging them feel a bit jankier, which leads to the classic bull-like combat dance with Halo 4's Hunters feeling messy and less refined than the Bungie titles. In fact, for the most part, Halo 4's Hunters are relatively absent from the campaign, not being used too creatively in missions, outside of a very memorable encounter which saw them trashing a UNSC laboratory as civilian researchers fled in terror. On the flip side, the game's Spartan Ops mode made much better use of the Hunters, sprinkling them with other enemies and even evoking some Bungie-era physical comedy as one swats aside an annoying grunt so that it can get a better shot at the player. Their combat dance may not have stuck the landing, but the new design certainly did. It was well regarded by players, but going forward, 343 would need to make a choice. The fence sitting wouldn't cut it. Do they refine the bull charge combat dance the Hunters are known for and allow them to truly shine as an addition to the Covenant's infantry, or take them in a completely new direction? And in 343's next major title, we'd see what choice they made. In 2015, the final chapter of 343's Reclaimer saga was released. It took Halo to its furthest point, leaving most if not all of Halo Reach's assets in the dust and providing a Reclaimer-era makeover to what was left. For better or worse, it was a game that explored the Reclaimer-era's take on the Halo universe in great detail. It wasn't just the designs that saw massive changes, however, because Halo 5 saw quite the seismic shakeup for Halo's favorite heavy infantry. The The Hunters of Halo 5 retain their Halo 4 models, albeit with upgraded materials and textures thanks to the increased horsepower of the new console. It also marks the first time in the franchise where Hunters being a complex colony of worms is not just alluded to, but outright demonstrated. Before encounters with Hunters, players can see them forming together, especially in the game's second level where they can be found slithering down the walls. And after a rather weak showing in Halo 4, this is what the Hunters needed to put them back in the spotlight, giving the towering titans the flair and style they were owed on next-gen consoles. The presentation of the Hunters of Halo 5 cannot be understated. As far as the gameplay goes, Halo 5's campaign was a 4-player squad-based shooter with AI filling in for any vacant spots. 4 players were always on the field at any given time during levels. What the developers came up with to provide an interesting engagement that required more teamwork to approach was redesigning the Hunters completely. They were removed from their heavy infantry role, which was then given to the improved Promethean Knight, which even received its own strategy for taking it down quickly. The Hunters were changed into fully fledged mini-bosses. Off the bat, the Hunters are far more defensive than normal, rarely moving around, repositioning, or chasing the player, opting to instead stay firmly planted and lob explosive shots at a distance. Occasionally, Hunters could make use of a tracking machine gun, launching a series of homing rounds at the player. Upon witnessing the death of a Bond brother, Halo 5's Hunters will enter an aggressive state, emitting electricity and charged up with a newfound energy. In this state, you'll find that they attack more often, are more aggressive, and are harder to take down, in stark contrast to previous games which had the Hunters weaker when they're separated from their brothers. For the most part, Halo 5's Hunters offered a unique spin on the classic enemy type, but something was lost in the transition to their new mini-boss role. In classic games, Hunters were balanced and designed to be a heavy enemy type. This meant that they could appear more often, sometimes multiple times in a single mission. Encounters with them were well-paced and kept the levels moving. In Halo 5, encounters with Hunters grind levels to a halt as players find themselves climbing around these jungle gym arenas, trying to whittle down the health of these mini-bosses. Ironically, the Promethean Knights were now more in line with Hunters than the actual Hunters. There's a noticeable inorganic separation between the Hunters during combat and the rest of the Covenant that simply didn't exist before. The choice was also made to make their melee attacks far more damaging and quick, and in some cases, killing players before the animation even connected. Combining this with some other visual oddities made getting close to Hunters extremely dangerous and not advised, essentially killing the classic bull charge combat dance the Hunters were known for. For better or worse, the Hunters were a new type of enemy now. Fans of the new combat design greatly enjoyed turning this enemy type into a boss experience, while others felt like it took Hunters out of the combat role they used to inhabit and put them in a less flexible one, not allowing them to exist as an organic part of the combat loop. One style of Hunter is not inherently better than the other. It all comes down to personal preference, how you feel Halo's campaigns should be paced. And for those who did enjoy the new Halo 5 mini-boss Hunters, the game's Warzone mode offered up even more takes on this style of Hunter. What Halo 5's Warzone doesn't offer in refined combat, it offers in variety of Hunter types. Swarm Lords, or sometimes referred to as Elders, are a variant of the Hunter that can be found in Warzone, donning unique white armor with purple accents. They often appear as high difficulty bosses that require huge groups of players to take on. Another, more common variant are the Red Serpent Hunters, which are beefier versions of the standard blues that can often be found spawning near or around bases and can be taken on by just a handful of players. The Hunters of Halo 5 were divisive. They were celebrated as a welcome change for those who enjoyed the new mini-boss design, but criticized by detractors for their pacing and what was removed from the standard Covenant combat loop. One thing is for certain though, what Halo 5 lacked in refinement, it more than made up for in production value and presentation. The Hunters of Halo 5 are an interesting chapter in Halo's history, and before we look at the latest game, let's explore the various ways they've been portrayed in spin-off material. Being one of Halo's most iconic enemies, it's not surprising that the Hunters have been featured in various spin-off material beyond the mainline games. Halo 2 has a rather infamous sound test which sees a grunt and a hunter assist the player in using their surround sound speaker system. Truly good times. In 2010, 343 Industries and Saber Interactive released Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary. It was a visual overhaul for the first Halo game. They used a mixture of Halo Reach, Halo 3, and some original assets to paint up the aging title. The game used Halo Reach's Hunter model and applied it over the Halo Combat Evolved animation skeleton. And it was an awkward fit, making the Hunters appear squat, colorless, and Saber forgot to give the Hunter's weapon a glow before they fire their cannons, which I should remind you is a pretty important piece of tactical information. Thankfully, for the remaster of Halo 2, a completely new model was created by Joel Mungian using a plugin for Modo called Mesh Fusion. This new model combined aspects of the Reach Hunters with that of the classic Hunters to craft one of the best depictions of the Hunters in the series. Minus one key flaw: their torsos sport armor which wasn't there in the original models, which means in the anniversary graphics, stomach shots do in fact damage Hunters, even if it doesn't seem like it. A minor visual discrepancy, however. In the world of animation, Halo's Hunters are ripe for interesting and unique artistic spins. One such example came from the Halo Legends anime short film, The Duel, which depicted the Hunters as massive, towering creatures of legend that need to be climbed and scaled in order to be defeated. In a more canonically accurate depiction, Halo 2 Anniversary has a collection of short films that can be discovered and watched. These short films provide glimpses into the Covenant's past, such as the time when the Hunters were first discovered by the Covenant, using boulders around them to form natural armor as they combined and formed into the silhouette we all know and love. For Halo 4's marketing, a series called Forward Unto Dawn was released that detailed the fall of a UNSC training world. A young man by the name of Thomas Lasky lures a Hunter's attention, just long enough for a 16-year-old Master Chief to board it and destroy it in a very similar fashion to Halo Reach's scrapped boarding mechanic. In the promotional miniseries Halo Nightfall, Hunters took on a more unique portrayal, instead demonstrating the dangers of hunter worms when not serving the Covenant. These hunter worms were a product of the Forerunners thousands of years ago attempting to create an organic weapon to use against the Flood. They made use of a variety of techniques to entrap and draw out their prey, rather ominously mimicking the silhouette of one of their victims. Books such as Halo Smoke and Shadows go to great lengths in giving depth to the Hunters. One particular chapter shows readers a hunter that survived a crash landing. This landing unfortunately took the life of its bond brother, leaving the single hunter isolated on this world for 26 years. When the protagonists of the book stumble upon this feral and wild surviving hunter, it's developed the ability to mimic a single sound, the word end, wishing to be killed so that it can join its lost brother, highlighting just how important the bond is between two hunters. Halo Wars 2, which released in 2017, introduced gamers to a new enemy force in the Halo universe, the Banished. The Banished were a collective of alien races that rejected the lies of the Covenant religious leaders and featured a unique, horned, brute aesthetic, dismissing the Covenant's royal purples and blues for scrap metal, steel, and various metals splashed with angry red paint. The Banished made greater use of the Hunter's abilities, allowing them to adopt new forms, and even for Bond brothers to fuse together into towering monsters referred to as Goliaths. The Banished even made use of Hunters in their command structure, with the Hunter Brothers Colony being a DLC character to use online and even go up against in the game's ODST-themed DLC. Colony have mastered the ability to mimic speech by vibrating the thousands of worms that made up their body, and it gives the two an eerie, calm but commanding presence.
Their hero eliminated. Continue on this path.
In one final look at live-action material, the Hunters made a brief appearance in Halo the series on Paramount Plus, where a hunter collapses its form and attacks UNSC Marines as the human Covenant spy Maquis infiltrates the ranks of humanity. It was a memorable sequence in a show that, for the most part, failed to capture the charm of the Halo universe. And with the announcement of Season 2 entering production, perhaps we can see more of the Hunters. And now, it's time to look at the latest entry in the Halo series. During the years following the release of Halo 5, 343 began exploring and concepting the next mainline Halo title. With little direction to go off of, Many artists crafted what is often called blue sky concepts. Essentially, the sky's the limit. Just go nuts and draw something cool. A lot of it is explorative, with the knowledge that most of it won't get used. During this period, the Hunters' explorations leaned more heavily into the aesthetic of the Reclaimer saga. More crustacean, more organic, more beetle-like, more alien. This exploratory period birthed rather interesting fruit. Among them was an enemy that was referred to as the Crusher. A massive beast that would tower over the player. In fact, the Crusher was foreshadowed in the game's 2018 engine demonstration, stomping by a tent and knocking over a radio with the weight of its footsteps. When production began on Halo Infinite, this Crusher enemy stepped up to the plate and took over the role of the Hunter for Halo Infinite's campaign, the first Halo game to not feature the Hunters. During combat, the Crusher was quite aggressive, using physics objects in the environment, hurling them at the player, as well as using powerful melee attacks to throw the player around. The Crushers were outfitted with control devices placed on them by the Banished, and once broken, it would turn the Crushers on their captors. Problems rose up, however. It simply wasn't that fun to fight. It didn't offer the same fun factor of the enemy it attempted to replace. If it's any consolation, in the open world, players could also encounter and fight roaming heavy sentinels. But like the Crusher, these enemies too faced issues, navigating the open world in organic ways. So the choice was made. The Crusher was scrapped, and the heavy sentinel was reworked into a story boss, and the Hunters were added back to the campaign. The Hunters of Halo Infinite sport a completely new model, built and colored to evoke memories of Combat Evolved's Covenant, despite serving the Banished. High-quality materials and a more saturated color scheme also help them pop. This is most notable with the specialized Ardent Hunters, which don the Banished red and sport more health and attack more aggressively. The Hunters of Halo Infinite initially may seem like they had a relatively smooth integration, but they suffered some side effects from their messy development history. Due to how late in production the Hunters were added, they mostly reused much of the Halo 5 behavior systems, which, as you can imagine, caused quite a few problems. Whether or not you preferred the mini-boss take of Halo 5, Halo 5's Hunters were designed for a squad of 4 to take them on in carefully controlled boss arenas. With Halo Infinite, there was no time to rework the level design or fine-tune the behaviors of the Hunters. In the final game, the Hunters do unfortunately reflect their development history, often being both overly defensive and overly aggressive, grinding combat pacing to a halt, and being quite a messy combat experience, which was in stark contrast to the rest of the rather well-paced combat loop. The classic bull charge dance of the Hunter was completely gone, and it was unfortunately an aspect of the campaign that developers felt bad about not having more time to fine-tune. As it stands, Halo Infinite's Hunter fights are more of a slog than they are a classy combat dance. The original vision of a heavy infantry unit with an exploitable weakness was gone. Now the Hunters were simply a tanky boss fight that overstayed their welcome. In the open world, a special version of the Hunter can be encountered in the form of the Myriad Hunters, which grant the player a special weapon upon defeating them. The Hunters of Halo Infinite were not what they could have been, doubling down on the weaknesses of Halo 5's Hunters without learning from their strengths. As the series looks towards the future, who's to say what's in store? But the Hunters will always be an important part of Halo, and it's safe to say we will see them again, hopefully stronger than ever. The Hunters of Halo have a long and storied history, beginning their life as a well-paced heavy unit to spice up encounters, to an impressively detailed, if a bit tedious, boss fight. What are your thoughts on them, though? Halo wouldn't be the same without their inclusion. What's your favorite version of the Hunters? Did you learn anything interesting today? If so, then consider leaving a like, sharing the video around, and if you haven't already, consider joining the channel as a member or becoming a patron. It's time to thank the members of the channel as well as the patrons whose names are going to appear on screen right now. And it's time for my impression of a Hunter. I'm leaving that in. Hi, buddy. His head was turning while I was coughing. What a little buggy.